Hi and welcome to my channel Explain. My name is EK and in this video I want to talk to you about the history of women's writing in medieval England. One of the many ways the medieval period in Western Europe is misrepresented is the idea that kind of scholarship and writing and texts simply ceased to exist. This is, mercifully, a misconception that's pretty much run out of steam these days, not least because we have so many texts in so many different genres that were being written, read and reproduced in the medieval period. A fallacy that still holds water, however, is that women were basically excluded from anything that wasn't marriage or child rearing. This is not true. Whilst women did not enjoy some kind of utopian existence in the medieval period in Western Europe, they were involved in everything. Unless you have a kind of all-male themyscira going on, then women are going to be involved, they're going to be present in some way, including in the history of literature and writing, and it is this involvement that I wish to outline here. Some of the texts I'm going to discuss were written by women, others were not. Some of the women I'm going to discuss were literate, some were not. How then can I call them writers and refer to women's writing? Well, because medievalists, particularly those focusing on gender history, are beginning to reassess how we define writing and how we might view and analyse kind of texts in this period. Texts here refer to kind of any piece of writing, and whether that is a letter, a manuscript collection, a work of hagiography, so something relating to saints, or an autobiography. A lot of these texts relate to hagiography and are usually described as lives, which is a translation from the Latin vita, which means, you know, lives. But the term vita is used very specifically for the spiritual biographies of different people who were perceived by whoever was writing it that this figure was an incredibly kind of devout person. And the kind of undercurrent, the elephant in the room in all Vitas, is that they clearly are seeking canonization of the subject of the biography. So yes, I'm going to talk about Vitas quite a lot in this, and that is what it means. I will start with three women who kind of mostly fit into the more conservative understanding of writing and go from there. Be prepared for lots of air quotes around terms that are kind of a bit more difficult to pin down, and to hear the word writing and possibly texts 80,000 times. It's texts. Julian of Norwich was a 14th century anchoress. An anchoress was a woman who lived, who kind of withdrew to a room, usually in the church or kind of next to a church or some kind of like monastic house, and they lived sometimes for the rest of their lives in a life of kind of semi-secluded religious contemplation. Julian was probably born around 1342 and at the age of 30 experienced a series of visions as she, quote, lay apparently dying. It's not clear, Henrietta Leyser tells us, whether this happened before or after she became an anchoress. Regardless, she ended up living until her death in 1416 in, quote, a cell belonging to Carrow Priory in Norfolk. Julian recorded her visions in a work that is known as Revelations of Divine Love, of which there are two versions, one shorter and one longer. Incidentally, and I mentioned this in my interview with Lauren Cole, which was my previous video, the most recent video on my channel, so go check that out. But I kind of said about how very often when you look at medieval manuscripts, the kind of titles are like not shorthand, but the abbreviations and things to reference them repeatedly in a paper, they become very complicated. There's lots of numbers. I think one of the texts to do with St Margaret of Scotland is called like Cotton Tiberius D or something, whereas Julian's ones are, the two versions are simply S for shorter and L for longer, and I respect that. Julian lived during a time when what Nicholas Watson describes as, quote, a golden age of mysticism had emerged on the continent. But Julian offers, according to Henrietta Leyser, quote, the first major English example of a female vision for 2 centuries. It is generally assumed, though not universally, that the short text was written by Julian a short time after her visions and that the longer text was written much later. The exact time gap between those 2 texts is not clear, but she does mention taking, quote, 20 years, save 3 months, to fully interpret what she had seen. Julian adopts the kind of traditional extreme humility of medieval writing. She says that readers should not, quote, take me for a teacher, for I don't intend that, no, never did so, for I am a woman, ignorant, weak and frail. This kind of cautious approach might also have limited the potential accusations of heresy, particularly as kind of movements for religious reform were emerging, of which more will be said later. Julian was very popular in her time. People came to discuss things with her and ask advice through a window to her little cell, and various Norwich residents left her money in their wills. After her death, Julian's work was not particularly well known, and her biographer Santha Bhattacharji writes that, quote, the near disappearance of her work after her death argues against any connection with a religious order. There seems to have been no community behind her with the wherewithal to preserve and publicise her works. Moreover, the long manuscript would have been lost entirely were it not for a group of Benedictine nuns dutifully copying the texts in the 17th century, and I will link to a documentary that offers kind of a biography of that manuscript in the description below. Turning now to one of the individuals who sought and received advice from Julian, we meet Marjorie Kempe.
She's got a point. She's an icon. She's a legend, and she is the moment. Now, come on now.
Marjorie Kempe lived in 15th century King's Lynn, then known as Bishop's Lynn. Her autobiography, called The Book of Marjorie Kempe, was written between 1436 and 1438, and it is perhaps the earliest autobiography in English. We only have the original text of the book by chance, although Kempe would probably perceive it as divine providence. An abridged version of the book was printed in the 16th century by one Wynkyn de Worde, so her existence was known, but what couldn't be known is how different Worde's version was from her original text, which remained all but lost until the 1930s. It travelled through various owners, including a Carthusian priory in York, but eventually ended up in the country mansion of one Colonel William Eardiswick Ignatius Butler Bowden. We are smashing it with the names in this video, I'm telling you. A dusty little manuscript in binding that had been, quote, nibbled by generations of hungry mice was found by the Colonel during a search for ping-pong balls, and it was only the curiosity of his guest, a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, that prevented the Colonel from dumping it on a bonfire. This guest, according to Janina Ramirez, told Colonel William Eardiswick Ignatius Butler Bowden that, quote, there may be something of real interest there which you may not at the moment realise. This guess was correct. The version of the text they had found was 18 times longer than Wynkyn de Worde's version. It described Marjorie Kempe's life, her visions and extensive pilgrimages, her intense piety and devotion, the responses of others to that piety and devotion, all while giving kind of incidental details about the life of an urban gentlewoman in 14th and 15th century Norfolk. This is even more astonishing when you discover that Marjorie Kempe was illiterate. Kempe was part of a wealthy urban elite. Her father was a successful merchant and had been mayor of King's Lynn and a member of parliament, though his influence and his status kind of declined over time. Marjorie married John Kempe, also from the merchant class, and the couple had 14 children together. After the birth of her first child, Marjorie experienced a severe postpartum illness that lasted over 8 months and only ended when Jesus appeared to her with, to quote Felicity Riddy, speaking words of comfort. Marjorie continued in her regular life after that, but her various business ventures failed, and perceiving this as a sign of divine punishment, she instead chose a life of devotion.
Fuck the drugs, fuck the cigarettes, fuck that dumb bitch. It all starts fucking today, alright?
She spent years on almost interminable pilgrimages, visiting sites across England, as well as Jerusalem, Flanders, Poland, Italy, France, the various German states, and Spain. Marjorie took to wearing Virginia white, which was considered quite scandalous, unsurprisingly, given her aforementioned 14 children, although she did end up living chastely. Part of Marjorie's devotional practice was the seemingly spontaneous and overwhelmingly loud crying, which is a pretty common feature of visionaries and kind of other female mystics, but it earned her the derision of various churchmen, while she remained constantly under the suspicion of heresy. As an aside, I've always taken Marjorie's devotion very much at face value, but I just finished reading Janina Ramirez's book Femina, and she categorises Marjorie's kind of holiness not so much as a cry for attention, but as a potential way to gain status. I don't think I agree, because Marjorie was kind of putting herself at such great risk by pursuing this life. She was challenging ecclesiastical authority, she was risking accusations of heresy, and she spent so much time in her life travelling in a world where travel was far longer, harder and more dangerous than it is today. But I think it is an interesting take. Marjorie did have allies as well. 3 male scribes, including her son, wrote the Book of Marjorie Kempe over several years. I'd wager that there are some who feel that Marjorie's scribes and not her were the writers, but I would respond by saying that when a politician kind of sends out a memo, or you receive a letter from a business person or kind of other professional, you would consider them the writer of that letter, even if it was typed up or transcribed by kind of a secretary or assistant or other kind of administrator. We have to consider the scribes, of course, when we are using it as a source. You know, ask what kind of influence her son and then these 2 clergymen might have had on the text. You know, was there discussions perhaps between the scribes and Marjorie on different stylistic choices, or, you know, the structure of the narrative, about what to include and what to omit. Yet ultimately it is Marjorie's own first-hand experience being told through Marjorie's voice in a literary medium. Marjorie Kempe is not the only illiterate woman on this list. Another 15th century woman, also from the Norfolk gentry, is Margaret Paston, who, despite being unable to write and potentially unable to read, she was, quote, the most prolific letter writer of her family. Margaret Paston was not an outlier in this. James Daybell tells us that, quote, most women's correspondence was ordinarily penned by amanuenses, a neutral term that includes formal secretaries in the sense of salaried individuals retained for writing services, as well as clerks or scribes and other individuals used in a secretarial capacity for correspondence. Handwriting analysis suggests that Margaret's correspondence were penned by as many as 29 different individuals. The epistolary legacy of the Paston family is singular. Their letters to one another were remarkably kept in the family until 1735 and eventually edited together as a collection in the 1780s. Through their letters to one another, we get these unique insights into this landowning gentry family who were eager to climb the social ladder. We get a window into this kind of nascent middle class that was emerging after the demographic changes wrought by the Black Death. And one of the voices that we hear, a voice which runs through the history of this family, is that of the matriarch, Margaret Paston, whose maiden name was Maltby. Margaret was a wealthy heiress, and her husband, John Paston, was a justice of the peace. They had 7 children, 2 of which were called John. So between 1444, when the 3rd John was born, and 1466, when the 1st John died, there were 3 John Pastons being referred to, seemingly with no confusion, in the letters that are sent between various family members. I don't know why this unhinges me like it does, but I just, you know, in my friendship group at school, we had a fair few Charlottes, and we gave them all nicknames. We called none of them Charlotte. We were like, if you can't all have it, none of you can have it, and we just, you know, invented nicknames, which... Why didn't they invent... Oh, it aggravates me. When John Paston I died in 1466, his eldest son, John Paston II, took over the family and spent pretty much all of his life trying to cement upon and expand the gains for the family that his father had made. A notable element of this was an attempt to make good on an inheritance that had been promised to John Paston by a soldier called Sir John Fastolf, not to be confused with Falstaff, Falstaff is based on Fastolf, but Shakespeare changed It doesn't matter. John Paston II was also busy trying to secure properties that had been brought to the family by Margaret through marriage. The Pastons are seemingly at the mercy of the Wheel of Fortune. John Paston I spent time in prison. He fell out with his eldest son for a time, and a complex set of rivalries led to their manor at Gresham being seized by force by the Baron of Hungerford, who claimed it actually belonged to his wife. I was trying to get hold of an image of Gresham Manor for this video. There are only kind of photos of it today. It's just like a big field covered in thorns, etc. But I'm absolutely obsessed. There is this website, this kind of project, which has created like a 3D version of how it may have ended up looking. And it eventually became known as Gresham Castle. I'm going to link to that video, to that website in the description, because I've been on it for hours. So yeah, no image in this video, unfortunately, but just enjoy that website because it's amazing. Around 1448, when John Paston I was still alive, the family set about retaking the manor, and Margaret, with her 2 young sons, moved into a house that was very near to it. She then, according to her biographer, quote, prepared for a siege. She wrote to her husband for the need for, quote, weapons and armour. She asked for crossbows, poleaxes, as well as almonds, sugar and fabric for clothing the children. The family's kind of more personal affairs were no less exciting. One of Margaret's daughters, called Marjorie, disgraced the family by falling in love with Robert Cal, who entirely reciprocated her affections. The scandal lay in the fact that Cal was, as manager of the Paston estates, quote, a servant. As Helen Castor explains, quote, the Paston's gentility was so recently acquired and potentially still so fragile that the idea of Marjorie wilfully throwing away her status by marrying into a family of shopkeepers was appalling and distressing in equal measure. So it's clear that Margaret Paston was the matriarch of a family in a position of tenuous status, but also a family that was determined to kind of improve their lot and secure the gains they had made. Margaret's letters show not only her role at the centre of these events as a stakeholder in her family's fortunes, it also preserved her family's history and their existence at this very specific moment in time for later centuries. Now, of these 3 women I've just discussed, only one, it seems, was able to write. This might lead some to argue that they weren't writers at all, basing that opinion almost on a technicality. But in fact, not only should we consider these women writers, we should be significantly expanding our understanding of medieval texts to house not simply those who wielded pen and ink, but those who patronised writers, commissioned and edited and translated texts, as well as women who owned and enjoyed and read and disseminated books and manuscripts in various forms. We don't have to think of them as writers necessarily, but if we exclude them from, you know, the historiography that centres on their literary legacy, we will never get even half of the full picture. For a start, literacy was not widespread enough for us to view writing the way we do now, and women who could read often couldn't write or didn't have ready access to writing materials. This is why scribes existed and what they were paid to do. Jennifer Summit questions if, quote, authorship, at least in its familiar modern sense, could be said to have existed in the Middle Ages at all. She claims that the author is so kind of venerated in scholarship, quote, the figure around whom ideas about literary tradition, authority and creativity are organised, but, she insists, quote, what counts as an author has been historically variable. So the idea of who merits this title of author is not fixed but has changed throughout history. She states that, quote, the modern idea of the author as a single creative individual holds limited relevance for medieval textual culture, in which many texts were collaborative, anonymous, or adopted as common property. So today, writers might write all or some of a book and negotiate its release, etc., with publishers involving kind of, you know, agencies perhaps. In the medieval period, writers were often commissioned for a specific text or purpose, or they might enjoy kind of general support from a wealthy individual who had some sway over the final product. Summit argues that, quote, rather than indicating that there were no female authors, such conditions indicate the need for an understanding of authorship that can take into account the range of medieval women's authorial activities. Diane Watt argues fervently and convincingly for this approach. There are texts by women, she says, describing them as, quote, women authored, but also those for and about women, which she calls women oriented. Texts which were written by men, but were shaped by and kind of owed their existence to women as much as men. Men's literary patronage is already understood in this vein, not least because historians are kind of well acquainted with considering male literary patrons as having key involvement in the creation of texts, and not just texts, art and architecture as well. We think of William the Conqueror as the instigator for the White Tower at the Tower of London, and to use a Scottish example, the guidebook of Linlithgow Palace neatly divides up phases of building work according to whatever James happened to be King of Scots at the time, despite the fact that Linlithgow often belonged not to the king but to the Queen Consort. And there definitely are comparable English examples, but A, I primarily study Scottish history, so I know these examples better, and two, when I was trying to think of examples, and I was looking through my books, and I was like, I really don't study much men's history, do I? It's just women, as far as the eye can see.
Women.
Back in England, the Wikipedia page for Bokenham Castle in East Sussex states, quote, it was built in 1385 by Sir Edward Dalingridge. Dalingridge was not an architect, he was not a mason, he was a knight. And so it is with literature. The Bedford Book of Hours are not named for their creator, but for the Duke and Duchess of Bedford, who gifted the book to Henry VI in 1430, while the Hours of Henry VII, gifted by the first Tudor king to his daughter Margaret, were certainly not created by Henry VII. If we are happy to look at kind of castles and palaces and paintings and tapestries and spend as much effort discovering who these items were made for as who they were made by, then this approach to kind of women's writing is just a continuation of that. I favour this more expansive methodology that allows you to find in the historiography of writing names such as Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York, who were noted literary patrons. We can consider religious texts commissioned by women like Edith of Wessex and Edith Matilda of Scotland, and those aimed at or dedicated to women like Osbern and Bokenham's Legend of Holy Women. We will begin with the patronage of Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York. Margaret Beaufort was the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. She was born in 1443 and she was the great-great-granddaughter of Edward III via his son John of Gaunt. Her father, the Duke of Somerset, died, never having met her, leaving Margaret a wealthy heiress. She was first married to the Duke of Suffolk as an infant, but this marriage was never, made canonically binding, and she seemingly considered her marriage to Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, as her first marriage, which took place when she was around 12 and he was around 15. With Edmund, she had a son named Henry, but Edmund died before the birth. Margaret spent the rest of her life working in tandem with Edmund's brother Jasper to secure the throne of England for her son as a Lancastrian claimant, and in 1485 that son took the crown at the Battle of Bosworth as Henry VII and the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret, styled as Our Lady the King's Mother, remained a prominent member of the royal household and was a noted literary patron. In the mid-15th century, Europe had finally caught up to the Eastern world and produced its own version of the printing press. Margaret commissioned several printings of texts, including Blanchardin and Eglantine in 1488, the Scala Perfectionis in 1494, and certain volumes in the Imitations and Following the Blessed Life of Our Saviour Christ in 1503, as well as some liturgical breviaries. What's more, some of these endeavours were a joint effort with her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York was the daughter of the Yorkist King Edward IV, so the rival faction to the Lancastrians, but when she married Henry VII in 1486, this kind of ended, for the most part, the dynastic conflict that we now call the Wars of the Roses. Margaret was certainly an imposing figure at court, and Elizabeth has usually been portrayed as being very much eclipsed by her mother-in-law, and Elizabeth's characterised as being quite meek and even long-suffering. But, you know, their personal feelings to one another are very hard to pick out, but they certainly collaborated in their literary patronage. In 1491, Elizabeth joined Margaret Beaufort in sponsoring a printing of the 15 Odes, and the pair also gifted a copy of Wynkin de Word's printing of Walter Hilton's Scholar Perfectionist to Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting, Marjorie Root. Elizabeth of York was not the first Queen Consort to take an interest in literary matters. Edith of Wessex is best known as the Queen Consort of Edward the Confessor, who was one of the last monarchs of pre-Norman England. Edith was the daughter of the Earl of Wessex, a prominent landowner, and she was raised at Wilton Abbey. This abbey had hosted various women of royal birth, such as Edith of Wilton, who was the daughter of King Edgar, and it may be that Edith of Wessex's sisters were raised there. Edward the Confessor's two great nieces, Margaret and Christina of Wessex, also likely spent some of their adolescence at Wilton. Edith of Wessex married Edward in 1045, 3 years after he had ascended to the throne. In 1051, however, her father and Edward fell out, and Edith was, quote, repudiated for perhaps a year. The pair never had children, and Edward's death in January of 1066 set the scene for the Norman conquest. Edith, incidentally, is one of only 3 women in the Biography tapestry where she is shown weeping at Edward's deathbed. Edith's literary output also centres on her husband. She commissioned the Vita Edwardis Regis, which was a spiritual biography of Edward, intended to show his piety, although according to her biographer Anne Williams, the text actually began as a history of her own family, later recast and continued as the life of her husband. The text characterises Edith's behaviour as kind of fulfilling an intercessory peace-weaving function that was expected of Queen Consorts in emulation of the Virgin Mary, who was known as the Queen of Heaven and considered the intercessor between God and humanity. Edith was not the only woman to commission religious texts like this. She wasn't even the only Edith. Edith Matilda of Scotland, who was Queen of England through her marriage to Henry I of England, engaged a monk named Turgot to write a biography of her mother, Margaret of Wessex. Margaret was Edith's great niece by marriage, and Margaret became Queen of Scots in 1070 through her marriage to Malcolm III of Scotland. Margaret lived an intensely pious life before dying in 1093, just days after the death of her husband and her eldest son. In the very beginning of the text, Turgot addresses Edith Matilda and kind of the reasons behind the commissioning. He says, "I congratulate you that having been established Queen of the English by the King of the Angels, you wish not only to hear but also to view unendingly a written life of your mother the Queen, who always longed for the kingdom of the angels, so that although you little knew the countenance of your mother, you might have fuller notice of her virtues." Edith Matilda had spent much of her childhood in Wessex, including at Romsey Abbey, where Margaret's sister Christina was abbess. Edith Matilda did return to Scotland in 1093, but after the death of her parents, she was forced back to England, sort of in exile. So Turgot is right. Edith Matilda didn't know, quote, the countenance of her mother, and perhaps, you know, commissioned the text in order to feel close to her. After returning to England, Edith Matilda married Henry I of England in 1100. This marriage joined the House of Wessex to the nascent Norman dynasty, and Edith's decision to venerate her mother accentuated that further. Henry could point to his mother-in-law's distinguished royal lineage as a way to legitimate his own rule and that of his descendants. So we have a range of kind of, you know, complex and often interdependent reasons behind the creation of this text, both personal and political. And to use Diane Watt's definitions, the text is doubly women-oriented. It was commissioned by and centred upon women, despite being written by a man. Edith Matilda also commissioned some translations, including one of the Voyage of St Brendan, which was a biography of the Irish monk St Brendan. Players of the Assassin's Creed game Valhalla might recognise Brendan and his tales of travel. In addition, Edith Matilda patronised William of Malmesbury in some of his chronicle work, so she's associated with quite a range of literary genres, and certainly the Vita of her mother was a key contributor to Margaret's canonisation. However, Margaret and these more local saints were not in the big leagues, particularly when discussing saints that appealed to women. That particular sphere of hagiography is dominated by the Virgin Martyrs. Jocelyn Wogan Brown tells us that, quote, among 12th and early 13th century Anglo-Norman lives of women saints, all, except Mary Magdalene and Mary of Egypt, are lives of consecrated virgins, virgin spouses, or virgin martyrs. Virgin martyrs were saintly women, usually young and beautiful, who were devout Christians. These women are invariably ordered to abandon their faith in some way, sometimes by a pagan spouse or their father, or some kind of heathen, i.e. non-Christian, authority, perhaps an emperor. The women refuse, usually getting brutally tortured, though Christ often prevents kind of the torture from doing actual harm, and then they are executed, earning them a place among the martyrs in heaven, and eventually being canonized. The stories are very much and then everybody clapped. In the life of St. Catherine of Alexandria, for example, the emperor who is trying to persuade her to kind of abandon her faith, he summons like 50 of the wisest philosophers and theologians to debate with her, but Catherine speaks so eloquently and so powerfully that some of them even convert to Christianity, as does the emperor's wife, who visits her while she is in captivity.
I was 18 telling everyone around me, I'm going to be a superstar, and everybody's going, yeah, whatever, she's an egomaniac, and then, haha.
The Virgin Martyrs are very much the medieval equivalents of Katniss Everdeen or Buffy Summers. They were, you know, literally cultural icons for young women in medieval Christendom. While originally much of the hagiography was in Latin, a language from which women were often barred by virtue of their exclusion from the world of scholarship, vernacular versions slowly emerged, such as the Legend of Holy Women, written in the 15th century by an Augustinian friar named Osbern Bokenham. The legend includes 13 biographies. 12 are of individual women, and then one is of the 11,000 virgins martyred with St. Ursula. So you've got 11,013 women, if you're including St. Ursula as not part of that 11,000. I ain't no government mathematician, what do I know? Of these 13 biographers, 7 were dedicated by Bokenham to named patrons, and of those 7, 6 were dedicated to women. First we have the Tale of St. Margaret of Antioch, dedicated to Thomas Burr, then St. Anne, who was the mother of the Virgin Mary, dedicated to Catherine Dunstan, her husband John of Melford, and their daughter Anne. Then we have St. Christina of Bolsena, 11,000 virgins, and St. Ursula, St. Faith, St. Agnes of Rome. St. Dorothy, who Bokenham dedicates to John Hunt and his wife Isabel. St. Mary Magdalene, at the request of Lady Isabel Borgia, who was a woman of royal lineage and the paternal aunt of Edward IV and Richard III of England. St. Catherine of Alexandria, dedicated to Catherine Howard, not that Catherine Howard, but the great-grandmother of that Catherine Howard. This Catherine Howard was the Duchess of Norfolk. Her maiden name was Mullins, so sometimes you'll see her referred to as that. I think possibly in the text she is referred to as that rather than Catherine Howard, so presumably it was before she was married, but she was the great-grandmother of the Catherine Howard and also Anne Boleyn. Number 10 is St. Cecilia, then St. Agatha of Sicily, dedicated to a woman called Agatha Flegg, St. Lucy of Syracuse, and finally St. Elizabeth of Hungary, dedicated to Elizabeth de Vere, the Countess of Oxford. Osbern's prologue to the text of St. Margaret of Antioch introduces himself with this usual kind of extreme humility and insistence on his own inferiority, which you find in myriad medieval texts. He writes, "The author was an Austin friar," he's referring to himself in the third person here, "whose name I will not just now reveal, lest the unworthiness of his person and his name make the work be scorned. So, because of personal dislike and malice, few would have the pleasure of reading it, and the work would be thrown into oblivion's corner." Like, you think you have imposter syndrome. Osbern Bokenham, he's basically just like, I'm not going to tell you who wrote this, even though I'm pretty sure he does eventually tell you who wrote this, but he says, I'm not going to tell you who wrote this because you all hate me and everyone thinks I'm rubbish, and I don't want them to dismiss the work just because they hate me. He says that, quote, "No one throws the rose away, though it grows on a thorny stem, and who is so foolish as to cast away good grain because it grows in chaff?" He's kind of asking his readers to look beyond his own limited capabilities for the task at hand. But what of the women to whom the text was dedicated? According to Sheila Delany, 2 individuals are explicitly named as commissioners, and, quote, "It is fair to assume that the others either commissioned lives of their patron saints or were rewarded with them in return for donations of land or money to Clare Priory, the well-connected establishment where Bokenham spent most of his life." So we've got a couple that are explicitly, these people commissioned it, and then the others were a supporter in some way of the priory. Delany emphasises women as, quote, "producers and consumers of texts," in much the way that what characterises the kind of broader literary role of women. But Delany cautions against assuming that these women had, quote, "a larger social influence or power that might prompt the neologism, how the fuck? A larger social influence or power that might prompt the neologism matronage." Delany acknowledges that this era enjoyed, quote, "an unprecedented flowering in the cultural role of women," but she argues that these women were valued by Bokenham not for themselves necessarily, but because of their male relatives and connections, particularly to those in the Yorkist faction of the 15th century Wars of the Roses, such as Lady Isabel Borgia, who her brother was Richard, the Duke of York. Delany also argues that the events of this conflict led to kind of increased emphasis on matrilineal descent, as so many of the key players in these dynastic conflicts owed their position in the succession to their mothers. Delany writes that Bokenham's interest in these women depends on dynastic politics and social conflicts, matters in which their husbands, sons and fathers participated but from which they were excluded. Nevertheless, I do feel like Bokenham's legend of holy women counts as, you know, women-oriented. Watt never claimed, after all, that these texts had to endeavour towards or kind of reflect female empowerment. It's kind of like the Bechdel test. A film can pass the Bechdel test and still be incredibly misogynist. Neither Bechdel or Watt are kind of conflating the presence of women with a positive message for women. In the case of medieval literature, it would take rather a long time to even define the loaded idea of positive messages for women, if it even could be defined meaningfully. See my previous video asking whether Anne Boleyn was the first feminist. Next, I want to explore a set of associated texts which Henrietta Leyser characterises as, quote, "a corpus of what has been seen as women's literature." This is not a formal corpus, but it contains several kind of collected texts.
I've got to be honest, I don't really know what I mean when I'm saying, like, oh, this isn't a formal corpus. What the fuck is a formal corpus? I think I mean that it's like, sometimes you get manuscripts that were collected together at the time, and then they get a name. And I think what I was trying to kind of explain was that this wasn't one manuscript collection that was assembled a long time ago. It's a few different manuscript kind of collections and texts that have been grouped together that Henrietta Leyser is kind of describing in this list of texts. I assume that's what... I mean, if that's not what I meant, then I'm pretty much at a loss, so...
Leyser includes in this set 3 groups. Firstly, the Anchorin Rule. Secondly, a set of 5 texts grouped together as the Catherine group. And also a series of meditations called the Wooing group. There's a lot of groups in groups, and detangling which group is of which and whomst of is less important than understanding the textual legacy of these religious women that were involved. I will begin with the Anchorin Rule, a 13th century guide for anchoresses, written by an anonymous author for 3 sisters of whom we know very little. It has been assumed they were from the Midlands because of the dialect of Middle English in which the text is written. Rules for anchoresses, these kind of guidelines, were often in English because even educated women were often not taught Latin. And Christopher Cannon actually argues that these texts held, quote, "a central role in the growth of English as a literary language." Some of the guidelines of the Anchorin Rule specifically relate to the keeping of animals, which was restricted to cats only. Cats seem to have kind of a lengthy association with monastic communities, not least because they are low maintenance and can keep vermin under control, vermin that might otherwise threaten food stores. And there's a manuscript from the medieval period, I think, that has paw prints in ink across the vellum. And I'm pretty sure there's also an example of marginalia, so bits scribbled in the margin, where the monk who is writing out this text mentions their resident mouser. The Anchorin rule also advises anchoresses to abstain from eating meat and that they should not own, quote, decorative clothing, and the window of their anchorage should be, quote, covered with a black curtain marked with a white cross inside and out. More broadly, the text has been evaluated for its kind of striking use of chivalric imagery and metaphor. Leyser writes that in the rule, quote, Christ is now the perfect knight, hero of a story that tells of a proud lady marooned and destitute in her castle, surrounded on all sides by implacable enemies. And the modernisation of the text that you can find on the British Library website relates that, quote, a lady was completely surrounded by her enemies, but a powerful king had fallen in love with her so passionately that he sent his messengers to woo her, one after another, often many together. He sent her many spectacular gifts of jewellery, provisions to support her, and help from his noble army to support her. The Anchorin rule was incredibly popular. Lara Farina tells us it was, quote, translated into French and Latin and survives in various forms in an impressive number of manuscripts. Other devotional literature in Leyser's collection includes the Catherine group, which consists of 3 vitae on St Margaret of Antioch, St Catherine of Alexandria, and Juliana of Nicomedia, respectively, as well as a text on the custody of the soul and a discourse on virginity known as Holy Maidenhood. Elizabeth Robertson describes this text as, quote, clearly created to meet the needs of female anchoritic audiences. Margaret, Catherine and Juliana were Virgin Martyrs from late antiquity, and Margaret and Catherine were included in Osbern Bokenham's Legend of Holy Women. Elizabeth Robertson picks up on a very kind of interesting contradiction of these religious texts that were largely written for and about anchoresses, which was meant to be a way of life that required isolation and seclusion from the outside world. But Robertson says, quote, in spite of the apparent solitariness of their spiritual enterprise, they required networks of support. These networks included those persons who encouraged and materially enabled the contemplative in her choice of life, the authors who wrote for and about them, the scribes who wrote down the words they said, and the monks, friars, secular canons and antiquarians who preserved and transmitted their literature. One manuscript version of the Anchorin rule, for example, reveals that the 3 sisters, the 3 anchoresses for whom the text was written, lived together with servants and also enjoyed the material support of a local lord. They also had, quote, an advisor intimately involved with them. Furthermore, the rule's popularity meant that it required kind of dissemination, thus involving, quote, scribes and authors, librarians, antiquarians, and religious reformers in the preservation and transmission of the original text. This again demonstrates how the modern kind of placing of the author on a pedestal is just utterly unsuited to medieval texts. If we only look at that individual who put quill to paper, we will never fully understand these texts or their significance. Today we are quite spoiled by translations. After the Bible, the most translated book in the world today is The Little Prince, originally published in French in the 1940s. It enjoys translations in over 500 languages. Also in the top 10 are Don Quixote, Alice in Wonderland, and the Communist Manifesto. Translation in medieval Western Europe was more complex. Firstly, the field of literature was dominated by kind of Latin and ancient Greek, knowledge of which was generally reserved for men, whether they were clergy or nobles or royals. So these texts needed translating if the general populace was going to enjoy them, which is quite a simple concept in itself, but once again, it is in fact more complex. As the Middle Ages wore on, translating works into the vernacular, essentially the local language, whether that was English, French, Scots, German, etc., these translations into the vernacular became more common. But translating religious works from Latin into the vernacular increasingly took on an air of danger as the first kind of embers of what would eventually become the Reformation began to glow. One of the kind of central tenets of a lot of reform in the late medieval period that eventually led to the Reformation was the desire to read scripture in the vernacular so that more people would be able to read it. But then, as now, something being difficult or risky didn't mean that nobody did it, and women were amongst those seeking to translate popular, often religious texts into the vernacular. Clemence of Barking was a Benedictine nun in the latter half of the 12th century, and she translated a life of St. Catherine of Alexandria into French. For Clemence, the act of translation itself was a, quote, act of devotion. She's not interested in kind of literary fame and believes it is a moral obligation, quote, of those who have knowledge to share it with others. Margaret Beaufort was another translator. I've discussed obviously her literary patronage already, but her confessor John Fisher tells us that Margaret also translated, quote, diverse matters of devotion out of French into English. These matters included a text on the Blessed Sacrament and another called Mirror of a Sinful Soul, which focused on, quote, human unworthiness. Dame Eleanor Hull was born around 1394 and spent some time in the dowager household of Joan of Navarre, who was widowed to Henry IV of England. Eleanor translated two texts, the Seven Psalms and Orisons and Meditations. The Seven Psalms was, quote, a commentary on the penitential psalms, mostly in French, but it included some Latin extracts that Eleanor translated into English. This was quite a risky task. As I said, translating the scriptures into English was potentially very dangerous in early 15th century England. The church was generally very opposed to the kind of reform-minded voices who wanted scripture in the vernacular, and one scholar, Bartlett, writes that, quote, in 1409, when she was still a girl, Archbishop Thomas Arundel had issued the Constitutions of Oxford. One of the elements of this constitution was to, quote, forbid anybody to make any written translation of a text of scripture into English or even to own a copy without diocesan permission of any such translation made since Wycliffe's time. However, Bartlett says that Eleanor was unlikely to have faced any consequences. The text was probably for her own personal devotions. She wasn't necessarily spreading it around, and she may have even enjoyed that diocesan permission. Bartlett writes that, quote, she was that sort of a girl, which I'm assuming is to mean like she was playing by the rules, and you know she would have sought and received that permission, but I don't know, it's a fun sentence. Dame Juliana Berners is far more of an enigma. Some don't believe she ever actually existed, though she is referenced in various texts in the late medieval period and named as the translator of the Book of Hunting, a text originally written in the 14th century in Anglo-Norman prose. Notably, it is not a religious text, but instead relates the kind of whys and wherefores of hunting game animals. I've only offered a very brief sampling here, and I've focused almost entirely on England. There are plenty of non-English examples, most famously Christine de Pizan and Hildegard of Bingen and the mysterious Marie de France. And the shifts in historiography that I've talked about here are, in the grand scheme of things, quite new. Who knows what we will find in the next decade or the next century. One other benefit of this kind of historiographical approach is it sidesteps some of the problems historians have with ascertaining the reading habits of medieval individuals. Book ownership was reserved for the very wealthy, and so it doesn't accurately reflect the actual reading habits of people. People might have borrowed texts or listened to them be read aloud, or even just have heard it repeated orally without use of the text. There's other issues as well. Books were so costly that they would be bequeathed in wills, sometimes as kind of family heirlooms. But wills left by medieval women were disproportionately those of widows, because if a woman predeceased her husband or her male family members, or any family members perhaps, they would automatically have her property. As the medieval period wore on, women's involvement in literature changed. As a gentry class began to emerge in the later medieval period, well-to-do women would be in charge of educating the children of their household. If she was literate, she might use and kind of draw together texts with which to teach them. Conduct books, for example, which aimed to kind of inculcate respectable behaviour in young people. The general message here is that there were women writing in medieval Western Europe with their own two hands, or with the employment of a scribe. But we need to look beyond simply the act of writing, beyond the idea of an author, and understand the kind of existence and lives of these different texts as a far broader endeavour. I will finish with my favourite quote of Julian of Norwich's Revelation of Divine Love. It reflects not only her religious devotion and deep, all-consuming faith, but also demonstrates her somewhat unique outlook on Christ, an outlook which, as the title of her work suggests, emphasised love above all else. In a section that shows Jesus speaking to Julian about sin, she writes of his assurance that, quote, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." I would love to hear your thoughts on these texts and the figures involved, and your opinion on this kind of approach to textual history there. Thank you ever so much for watching, and until next time.